Hello, class. Mr. Royans here, coming at you with a new reading mini lesson. And today, I'm a little apprehensive to start this one because we talked about setting a little bit. And you guys seem to get it for the most part. Setting isn't a super difficult concept, I don't think. We can all kind of think about the setting of a book and where it takes place. But I want to talk about something that's kind of intertwined with setting, and that is plot. And plot is a pretty interesting thing to me personally, as a lover of literature, as a lover of just reading and stories and all that stuff, because plot is what happens in a story. But what we're going to focus on today is we're going to look at mapping out plot, okay? And usually there's 5 main things to plot, but the first we're gonna go over all 5, but I'm going to tell you the 3 main ones as we go along. And I'm gonna chart it as something that's gonna look like this. It's gonna be kind of a rising graph. And this first part, let me get my markers out here, is the exposition. Exposition. It's kind of a fun word to say. Exposition. Exposition is the beginning of the story. I'm gonna write in green here just because. It's the beginning of the story, and it is where we learn about our characters. Beginning of the story, where the characters in the setting are introduced. Characters and setting are introduced. So we start reading a book, and it begins telling us where the story is taking place. We begin learning who some of these characters are. For instance, in Freak the Mighty, we begin by learning about Maxwell. And it starts off with his time at daycare when he's the kicker, but then it shifts gears. We're introduced to Maxwell, we're introduced to Kevin, but then we're introduced to Maxwell as he's older, living with Grim and Graham, that setting of that area by the Testaments, remember? So we're introduced to that setting, the beginning of the story, where the characters in the setting are introduced. And then we have what we're going to call, and it's very clever, rising action. Okay? The rising action. And where's my purple? The rising action, I'm going to write it along here, is where the main character, rising action, it's where the main character faces a series of conflicts. And what do I mean by conflicts? Well, problems, challenges, something they have to overcome, right? Or the rising action. So we're introduced to Maxwell, right? sorry, get the book out. We're introduced to Maxwell. We're introduced to Freak. And then conflicts happen. What are the series of conflicts that they have to overcome? A series of conflicts. Not just one, but a series. There could be Maxwell's inability to really connect with other human beings. That's a conflict. Then he connects with Kevin. There's a series of conflicts with, remember Tony D and the Knives? They're out there at the 4th of July party. They go find Loretta's purse as a treasure hunt. Okay, so I'm like, oh yeah, those are conflicts. Then at the top of our point is the climax. And that's right here at the top of our chart, for lack of a better word. There's my red one. And that's the climax. And I'm going to write right here in red. Maybe you've heard that word before. It's like a build-up. The climax is the build-up. And it's the most exciting part of the story. The most exciting part of the story. Semicolon there, because I'm going to say it's when we learn the outcome. When we learn the outcome. Okay. So, what's the climax of Freak the Mighty then? If you remember back to our setting lesson, when they're in the New Testament and he's taken by Killer Cain, he's abducted, and he has to be rescued. Kevin comes in and squirts with cayenne pepper and lemon. So it's the most exciting part of the story. It's when we learn the outcome. Like, oh my. Like, that's exciting stuff. That's crazy, right? Then we have the, I'm going to call this the falling action. I'm not going to call it, that is what it's called. I'm not just making it up, no matter what that might sound like. Oops. Falling action. So we have rising action, climax, falling action. And this is the events leading to the end of the story. The events leading to the end of the story. So, Kevin getting sick, Maxwell, the climax, Maxwell gets rescued, or he gets kidnapped by his dad, gets rescued, the falling actions, the events leading to the end of the story. Kevin gets sick, Kevin gets in the hospital, Kevin dies, and then we're left with the resolution. The resolution. And that is where it's the end of the story. End of the story. Okay? So, the 5 parts. And this is important, guys. This will, if you can master this, it'll help you figure out what is the story about? What happens in a story? And you can quickly, it'll help with your summary, okay? So we start with the exposition. It's the beginning of story where the characters and the setting are introduced. Like I said, we have Kevin and Max introduced. Okay, and we find out that they live in these kind of a crummy apartment complex area. Rising action, where the main character faces a series of conflicts. So Kevin, like I said, Kevin and Max are freaking mighty, fighting Tony D and running into the mill pond. Kevin and Max finding Loretta's purse. Kevin and Max going to school. That's a rising action. It faces a series of conflicts. And the climax is the most exciting part of the story. The most exciting part of the story where we learn the outcome. And I think you'd agree with me that the most exciting part of the story is where Max is abducted by his dad. Killer Kane takes him out of the basement, leads him to the New Testaments, and, tries to kidnap him and get away. And then Freak saves him. Freak and Loretta and the cops, but, we like to give all the credit to my boy Kevin. And then there's the falling action. The events leading to the end of the story. The events leading to the end of the story. So Kevin, it's Christmas. Some time has passed since the abduction. Or maybe it's past Christmas, isn't it? It was Kevin's birthday. That's what it was. Yeah, because Christmas was when he was abducted. Kevin's birthday. Then they're at Kevin's birthday, and he gets sick, and he gets hospitalized. And then he dies. But that's not the end. The death of Kevin isn't the resolution. It's not the end of the story. The end of the story is when Maxwell finally he talks to Loretta, and she asks him what he's doing. He says nothing, and she says, "Doing nothing's kind of a drag, kid. Think about it." And then he goes, "Yeah, you're right. I'm gonna write." He writes the story of Freak the Mighty. That's the end of the story. The resolution is he decides to fulfill Kevin's wish of writing down the adventures of Freak the Mighty. Okay? Did you see that? It was kind of a summary of the whole book too, right? 260 pages summed up, or actually that's only 160. Yeah, 160 pages summed up like that just by examining the plot. And the three most important facets of this are going to be the beginning, middle, and end. What happens at the beginning, what happens in the middle, what happens at the end. That's the plot. What happens in the story. But I like to frame it as the rising action, climax, and falling action. Exposition is the beginning of the story where characters and setting are introduced. Resolution, the end of the story. Okay? So what I'm going to ask for you guys to do after watching this lesson is I'm going to give you a chart. I'm going to ask you to fill out the exposition for First Rule of Punk. You're going to tell me who are the characters, and what was the setting that was introduced, the first part of this plot. And maybe I'll even have you tell me one aspect of the rising action where the main character faces a series of conflicts. Because Malu's already faced a conflict right now, hasn't she? Where she's moving. She's kind of at odds with, she's got to overcome moving to a new city, the beginning of middle school. Okay? All right, guys. I appreciate you. Those of you that are watching these lessons, keep it going. You're doing great work. And plot's fun. It's good stuff. We're going to examine some stories and stuff. All right.